records early on, and so they kept tapes, audio tapes, little bits of film and video, and other ephemera from the beginning, and kind of kept it individually among the band members, and stashed it away from 1983 when the band formed until 1996 when I started. When I started, the archives was a brick room that backed up against an oven at the place, at the restaurant next door. But it was a nice little room, and it was my office, and it was the beginning of the Phish archives as a formal collection. So at that time, there was sort of a cabinet of tapes, and all our reel-to-reels and most of our masters were off-site at a place called the Fortress in Boston. Does anybody know about that place? Great big blue building with a giant, really giant lock on the side, big padlock. And so that was the thing, and my role when I came in was to try to integrate those collections into one place. So our holdings consist of a wide variety of items. It's not just audiovisual, it's a lot of memorabilia, stage props, some costumes, clothing, a lot of paper, business records, the background of the band's record label, which they now have their own, background of the record deals, and audio and video spanning essentially their whole career. So it's a broad collection. It's really all-encompassing, and that's what they wanted. We have everything from fan mail to flying hot dogs, and the usual audio and video tape that you would expect in that kind of collection, and that really gets used mostly.
And so, from the beginning, they just started recording.
Well, luckily they did record the very beginning, the first show, and the archives are reasonably extensive for the first few years. And then when the band got a little bit more busy and popular, they had quite a few fans who were tapers and collectors, which is where that was my original background. And so they sort of fell off through the years, through the later 80s and into the beginning of the 90s, because a lot of fans were catching that stuff and capturing it. And they also gave parts of it away, and things were lost and found. But yeah, they did keep stuff starting at the very beginning, and it was around 1994 so that they really got serious. By the time I came in 1996, I tried to keep whatever pressure was needed on them to hold all the stuff, and they did. It was natural for them to do it, and evidenced by the fact that they wanted to have an archivist and an archive.
So by the time Phish came around, this concept of the taper culture had already existed, but that wasn't the case when the Grateful Dead started. So when they started doing recordings, it was for a whole different reason.
Well, it was an inadvertent archive. And what happened? There we go. Around early '66, the Dead didn't really record anything in '65, and in '66 they got a new sound guy who, Owsley Stanley, known as the Bear. He became the band's benefactor. He made a huge amount of, in the time, a huge amount of money illicitly manufacturing LSD. And he heard the band a few times, and he said, I really want to be in with these guys, so come down to LA. All we'll do all day is we'll practice, we'll get really good, we'll get some gigs, and then we'll maybe get a record contract. So they moved down to LA, and Bear recorded everything. I won't say everything. Bear recorded a lot. Dozens and dozens of 10-inch reels of analog tape, which, what's that, 45 years old now, still in absolutely mint condition. So Bear started recording with one reason. Bear loved running tape, and Bear was the first person to know that, or to think that the band, Grateful Dead, were onto something that was historically significant. And this was from the very first day. He knew that something special was happening. Bear was a bit of a visionary, still is. Lives in Australia now, off the grid so that no one knows where he is. But he started recording because he knew something special was happening. But the band saw it for very different reasons. They could listen back to these tapes of the rehearsals of the shows, critique the performance, and get better. So Bear was around from about 66, and then he left in 67, went to work with other bands. So there's a big gap in the Dead's collection because nobody thought it was important to do 67, 68. Bear came back in late 68, so really from 68 to 70, everything was recorded because Bear knew something special was happening. And again, on the road, the band would want to listen back to these performances, critique it, and maybe get a little better. And it seemed to work. You know, they really seemed to make less mistakes as they went on. And the things that worked, they would build up the next time in concert. So on the road, they would have a hotel room where they'd go and listen to these tapes. So at the end of every tour, they would come back with hundreds of tapes. Each show would be 5 to 7 reels. And they'd come back from these extensive tours with all these tapes that would end up at a band warehouse. This is in the early 70s, and early 70s. And then in mid-70s, Bear went away for 2 years, and it took about 6 months for anybody on the crew to realize that maybe we should start recording again. So there's a big gap. But anyhow, it was in early 1971 when really definitively somebody on the crew said, let's record every show. And mainly so the band again could critique. They never saw this as a commercial archive. They never looked down the road to 2011 and saw that we'd be releasing this stuff on a commercial level. So the band just kept recording, and it became one crew member's role on every tour or year by year, where, as we were saying, that the keyboard tech would also be running tape. So that was just one of his duties on the road. So you have entire tours from the early 71 right through the end, where every single show was recorded. Some gaps, with maybe the tape deck was broken, whatever it is. But for the most part, everything was recorded. And then when they knew they were playing well and they knew they owed the record company an album and wanted to do a live album, they recorded a lot of stuff on multitrack. So anyhow, how did the archive come about was that everything got recorded either for historical purposes, because Owsley saw it that way, or because the band wanted to critique things, and then there's a multitrack that was specifically done for album purposes. So without even knowing it, the band had in 30 years created an archive of 20,000 tapes, and then videotapes started coming in when they do the big stadiums with the big screens. So then you have 4,000 or 5,000 videotapes on top of that, and then we have, as Kevin was saying, all the business records and like every kind of paper, photos. That didn't have too many stage props, and flying hot dogs, but there were some cool things. And the tapes are still the band's, but it became too much to store. So everything else was recently donated to a university where it could properly be taken care of. They needed the institutional setting rather than a warehouse that they'd have to pay rent on. As these guys are, one of them is 70, a bunch of them in the mid-60s. It's something that in 20 years they wanted the institutional security of knowing it was in a university. So the non-music archives, which was massive, went to University of Santa Cruz. And that had been collected because in 1970, a woman named Eileen Law, who was really into the Grateful Dead at the time, and she had a really straight job in 67 to 69. She didn't enjoy it. She didn't enjoy going into an office. And so she showed up at the Dead's door and said, who's taking care of your stuff? Not tapes, but everything else. And they said, just come on in and do it. And then she started the band club called Deadheads. And if you look at the 1971 record called Skull and Roses, there's a call for Deadheads that says, who are you, how are you, where are you? Send us your name and we'll keep you in touch. Dead Freaks Unite. And that was Eileen's doing to get that in there. And that was the beginning of the Grateful Dead mailing list that really is where the name Deadheads really started. And things started coming into Eileen, so she collected them. Before you know it, it was a 6,000 square foot warehouse filled with everything but the music. So it was a little two-part thing. It's an inadvertent archive. Things came in, crew would go on the road, Eileen wouldn't, they'd come back with all the tour posters and shirts and stuff.
Storage. Where, how, for both of you, as it piles up?
Great. Okay, so I started in 1996 in this office. It was maybe 400 square feet, and we had thousands of tapes at the Fortress, and most of the two-track collection in sort of a chest of office drawers inside this room next to the oven. And I started my career because I don't have a lot of formal archive training, in fact, none at that time, by reaching out to the other archivists in the community. So one of the first people I reached out to I reached out to Kirk West from the Allman Brothers Band. They call him the Wizard. And he now runs what's become a museum, the Big House, the Allman Brothers. And